As a 22-year-old born and brought up in London in a predominantly South Asian area, growing up in a Hindu household, I was introduced to the main concepts within Hinduism and Indian culture, such as dharma, karma, reincarnation, and the soul. I vividly remember watching series such as the Mahabharata every weekend growing up. As a family, we also visited many different types of mandirs, but when I was in the presence of a murti or an idol, I often would not feel anything. I didn't understand much about the philosophy behind why we used to do certain things. For example, what does this prayer mean? Why are we offering fire to God? Why are we praying to statues, etc.? Despite feeling somewhat of a spiritual connection to Hinduism when I would go to the temple, as I started to get older and question things, the idea of a God, especially as a personality, Bhagavan, seemed so implausible and irrational to believe. This transition happened when I was about 14 and I started to resonate with many of the arguments of prominent atheists, such as Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. I remember reading The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, which further entrenched my lack of belief of a God or higher power. However, I was still very interested in spirituality as a whole, void of a higher power, as when I was younger I did somewhat feel a spiritual connection and I held on to that. There were quite a few arguments in convincing me that there was no higher power or God. One such argument was determinism. This was mentioned in a previous video called The Illusion of Free Will, which I would highly recommend you check out if you are unsure of this term. To put it simply, determinism is the idea that there's a causal chain of events that cannot be interrupted and means that we don't have free will. The idea of not having free will meant morality and therefore a higher power didn't make too much sense, as we don't have any agency to act in a quote-unquote godly way. Another argument which didn't make too much sense to me was the design argument, the idea that the universe had to be designed because of its beauty, symmetry and complexity. This just didn't convince me. I always used to think that there would be no way to tell if the universe was designed or just happened to be this way. We don't know any different. So there's no reference point to tell us if this universe is intelligently designed. As the default position is to not believe in a higher power until proven otherwise, this argument didn't sway me. The final argument which convinced me was the huge amounts of suffering happening in the world. It seemed so unjustifiable and illogical to believe that a kind and all-loving God would allow such endurance of pain to people. A specific reason why I moved away from Hinduism was because of all of the hard to believe quote-unquote mythologies. The stories were very hard to accept, especially some of the mystical powers that people seemed to possess at that time. For example, in the epic The Mahabharata, personalities would shoot one arrow which was split into many arrows. Here is an example of podcaster Joe Rogan trying to come to terms with the idea of a vimana, an ancient mode of transport mentioned in the Mahabharata.
Weaponry, they say, we're done with sound. If you study, there's one book called the Donner.
But do you think this is real?
Do I think it's real? I think it could be. I don't think it's definite. I definitely don't know.
So you think at one point in time, human beings had vimanas and they flew around the sky, and then they had weapons that used sound?
Could. Why not?
Was no evidence, archaeological evidence, that there was a flying craft or that there was ever any technology that allowed people to leave gravity?
Yeah, there may not be evidence.
So what changed for me to believe in a higher power? The idea of determinism started to lead me to look into causation arguments for God. Everything dependent within this universe has to have a cause. However, there had to be a first mover who started the chain of cause and effects. This entity would have to have intelligence to create this causal chain, and also has to be outside of time to be independent of the causal chain. Some atheists' rebuttal against this point were to suggest that the universe could have come from absolute nothingness, which we have no experience of. And this is true because even in a vacuum, there is still mass, meaning that it's not complete nothingness. However, the description of the universe coming from an intelligent being seemed to make more sense than it coming from nothing, as even though humans have never experienced nothingness, it seems more plausible to suggest something cannot come from nothing based on our experience as human beings. However, I still didn't believe that this higher power had any bearing on our lives right now and had no judgment of our actions. The next big concept which led me to believe in a higher power that had judgment of our actions was morality. If you have an atheistic worldview, you are forced to be morally nihilistic. You have no grounds to believe in morality. Some sense of morality seems to be thoroughly ingrained in us as humans. This could be argued as an evolutionary developed trait to increase chances of survival. However, this still means that there are no clear boundaries of what is right and wrong, as morality is just a social construct. Morality can only be defined if humans have a higher purpose and/or an existence of a higher power who has a standard for how we should live. Morality in life as a whole did not make too much sense from a deterministic point of view either, that we have no moral agency and can't be blamed for our actions. In order for there to be free will, there has to be something within us that is not material and will not be part of the dependent cause and effect chain of events. Hence, something inside of us that is making decisions has to be non-material, i.e. spiritual in nature, which is our real selves. Without realizing, this understanding of us not being the body and being a spirit soul is central within Hinduism, especially in the Bhagavad Gita. Philosophy is all very well, but you cannot think and logic yourself to the absolute truth. If you could, then there would be no debate amongst different belief systems and there would be only one belief held by human beings. However, as this is obviously not the case, a practical experience of this higher power is required to increase faith. People claim to have a connection with the divine from many different religions and faiths. It really didn't make sense to me that there's only one way to connect with God, given all our personality differences, varying upbringings and exposure to certain religions. I found the essence of most of these religions to be love of God. The only philosophies which preach that there are many paths to achieve this were found in Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism. Furthermore, reincarnation is a concept that is only accepted by the dharmic religions, Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism and Buddhism. The evidence for reincarnation is rife, and if you'd like to find out more about it, please watch my video, Is This Your First and Only Life, to gain a real insight into this. The philosophical implications of reincarnation are also very intellectually satisfying. The huge suffering of innocent people can be explained by sins committed in past lives, which are meant to serve as an equal and opposite reaction to our actions, to drive us to learn from our mistakes. It also means that God is not impartial, making one life a lot harder than another person's life for no seemingly apparent reason without the idea of reincarnation. With all of these conclusions, Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma had the answers for what I was searching for. There is a lot more to this, specifically regarding the philosophy and personal experiences after trying certain spiritual practices, which turned me more towards the Eastern world for spirituality. But what I would say is that I'm still on a journey, having doubts and questions about my beliefs every day. And I do not speak as a source of authority, but somebody who has just been given some knowledge that I'd like to pass on. I hope this was insightful and let you know a bit more about my journey, and I'd love to know about some of yours down in the comments below. Thanks for watching and take care. Please subscribe.